You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. James Fox from FutureSox is going to be on the show. International signings are happening, and there is an international pitcher that we've talked about on the show, Sasaki.
Rōki Sasaki.
He's got several teams that are trying to sign him, but the amount of money he's going to cost, they suddenly aren't going to be able to sign the guys they were prepared to sign. So now these guys are floating out there in the wind. The White Sox picked up one of them in the last 24 hours, an international prospect that they should have never had a chance to grab. And there might be more moves, so Fox is going to come on and talk about what's happening. It's very unique. And also talk about the logjam in the infield, because I want to talk to him a little bit about that. Omar Narvaez is back.
Yeah, speaking of future Sox, once in future White Sox catcher Omar Narvaez.
He was the catcher before the rebuild really begins, remember? Like, he's
right.
The guy.
His trade is one of the first things that starts this off.
Right, and I liked him because he was an offensive catcher. He actually had a couple of years in there where he was a pretty good catcher. Like, there. If you were in a 10-team fantasy league trying to get points from guys who had offense, he was on somebody's team. And
right.
now he's back and he's with the White Sox, and I don't even know if he makes the team. It's a minor league deal, but they've added yet another catcher. And I see people like reacting to these signings, and I feel like I got to do a public service announcement for people. Like, look, they're going to add parts. They're going to add bodies. They got to have enough catchers in camp so that they can catch all these pitchers on two different fields. They're going to bring in people that they know, even though that guy's got a snowball's chance in hell of actually making the team. They're going to bring in a lot of arms, and most of these guys don't really have a chance, but maybe they do something amazing and they get the last spot in the bullpen or something like that. There's going to be competition for starting pitcher. Like, I don't agree with the idea that Bryce Wilson is going to be one of the 5 starters on this team necessarily. Martin Perez is going to be one of the 5 starters, I would think.
I would assume so.
He's there for a reason to put a veteran presence in there. But when you look at guys like Jonathan Cannon, Davis Martin, Sean Burke, Drew Thorpe, Bryce Wilson, that's 5 names with 4 spots right there. Iriarte may become a starter. He may challenge. There's a few guys. Eater may get an opportunity. There's Mason Adams looked great at the end of the year. Plus you've got the 2 big guys, Hagen Smith, Noah Schultz. They're not going to break camp likely with the team, but they're going to be here eventually. So that's going to be really interesting. There's a lot of competition, and there's going to be a lot of position battles in the spring. Now, do you, Ed, put stock into the way somebody performs in that month or so of spring training, or do you rather expect your ball club to know generally who they're bringing? Like, they have a 26-man roster kind of penciled in, and maybe 1 or 2 guys get changed in or out, but you don't want, would you like to see open competition and Will Venable say, I have no idea who's going to make this team, we'll find out in 4 weeks? Should spring training matter that much?
Well, it's both, right? Because I assume what happens is that Chris Getz, Josh Barfield, and Brian Bannister, and to a certain degree now Ryan Fuller, maybe even with some of the holdover coaching staff, Grady Sizemore is probably involved in that. They, along with Will Venable, based on what they saw last year and what the reports are coming out of the minor leagues for some of these guys that didn't appear in a White Sox uniform, they probably have a pretty good idea of who's in the lead, right? There's always going to be a depth chart. There's always going to be number ones that are put out there. But the question is, do they have to publicly state that? And if they do not publicly state it, do they even have to internally state it? Or just let it play out and use spring training as a metric to see who shows up ready to go. And some of that's going to be judged on attitude. Some of that's going to be judged on success on the field. But it's entirely possible that it's just what they think is going to happen, what they would like to see happen, and then what actually happens, because somebody is bound to disappoint. There's somebody that is going to come into spring training that this staff and front office have been excited to see what they're going to do, and they're going to come in and they're going to look terrible. It'll be, whether it's a pitcher who comes in and cannot throw strikes. Let's say it's Sean Burke. Okay, I'm not saying this is going to happen to Sean Burke, but Sean Burke comes out of the end of last season seemingly with an inside track to make the rotation this year based on what he did.
I mean, he looked good. He only pitched in 3 games, but he pitched in 3 games with a 1.42 ERA. Now, does that mean he's ready and he's going to come in, he's going to dominate in spring, and he's going to be one of the 5 guys in that rotation, and he's going to come out and go gangbusters? Or did he run into a couple of teams that might have been done, or lineups that were featuring September call-ups, and maybe he's not that guy quite yet, or maybe never becomes that guy? So, I mean, like, with a guy like him, it's hard to gauge because he's going to get a lot of guys that aren't really major leaguers when he pitches in spring training. Like, that's my point.
Right.
Just as much as you're trying out players, other teams are trying out players. There's A rosters, there's B rosters. So, like, what can you really learn in spring training? Perfect example, we're going to get into this with James Fox. All these guys in the infield. There's way too many infielders than there are positions on this team on the 26-man roster. It very easily put. You could, look at what's going to show up in camp. Not only at first base are you going to have Andrew Vaughn, and Miguel Vargas could go stand over at first base, and Lenin Sosa could stand over there, but Bobby Dalbec's going to be there, and Andre Lipschitz and Tim Elko's going to be there. You have a lot of guys that are going to show up, okay? When you look around the infield, just at names that have touched the majors or might be slated to make it on this team, you got Vaughn, you got Vargas, you got Lenin Sosa, you got Josh Rojas. Who else do I have here? Brooks Baldwin is a name that'll be inside of the mix that could be sitting in the infield. You have Brian Ramos is going to be in the mix.
Right.
Colson Montgomery is going to be in the mix.
Right.
You're going to have Chase Mydroth is going to be in the mix. That's too many guys. So
too many guys.
Do they know going in the spring who their guys are? Or are they really going to, against less than major league talent, when the pitchers are still warming up, make a decision based upon what a guy does over just a couple of weeks in Arizona?
Well, I bet you what they do is they look at approach, they look at mentality for the position players. They're probably looking at how they're doing defensively, whether or not they're missing balls, missing assignments, missing open plays. All these things that, can kind of go into what are you really doing out there? Because you're right, anybody, and the outfield can be the same way. I mean, there's a little bit of a glut for the outfield, not as bad as the infield, but there's a little bit of a glut for the outfield. And now with Omar Narvaez, frankly, there's a little bit of a glut at catcher for even a number 2 catcher. So is it going to be who pulls the most balls out of the thin Arizona air and knocks them into the seat?
It shouldn't be that.
Or is it going to be the guy that shows up and is like, all right, he's tracking pitches well. He's using all parts of the field. His approach is right on. His head's in the right spot. That's what we're looking for.
Well, that's what it should be. It should be, are they playing the game the right way? Are they paying attention to the signs out there? Are they playing good defense? Are they in the right position? Do they have the right attitude? Because honest to goodness, you can't tell me the difference between some of these players. I know you gave up players to get Miguel Vargas, and you want to believe in his pedigree that he's going to be good. But if he goes out there and he's dogging it, or he's not one of those guys that's paying attention to the way that Will Venable wants to run the team, like whatever the White Sox way is, he's just not on board. Even if he's hitting the ball well, that shouldn't matter, because in AAA, he's a superstar. In small sample size in spring training, he convinced the Dodgers that he should get half a season with a start every day at second base a couple years back, and he did nothing with it. So he may have a great spring, but it really should matter what are the intangibles, because you don't want to. I understand that the inclination is going to be, we gave up something to get this guy, and he's got a good pedigree, so he's definitely going to make the team. And he may be penciled in there right now, but and I don't even know if he's going to dog it out there. I'm not saying that's what he is. I'm just using him as an example. If a guy like that hits well, it really shouldn't matter very much, because he's done it before and then not been able to perform during the regular season. It really should matter what kind of a player, what kind of a clubhouse guy, what kind of attention is he paying, and is he doing the things that will translate over a long 162 game stretch that will give him the opportunity to finally realize the potential that he has. That's how he needs to be evaluated. And as fans, that's how I'm evaluating the new coaching staff and Chris Getz. And the only thing that gives me a little bit of hope is that Chris Getz has been heartless so far with some of these DFAs and waivers and guys that he's moved on from the team. His 40-man roster looks very different now than it did just a couple of months ago. He's jettisoning guys. He's moving on, and he doesn't seem to have too much attachment. So that's the hope. The hope is that they're evaluating in the proper way in spring, because you're not winning anything. But the name of the game here is identifying the guys that have potential, that actually have the best chance of realizing that potential and are showing you something in spring that, hey, last year was last year. I'm ready to go. Andrew Vaughn comes out and plays really hard, but you're seeing him make the same mistakes. He's not listening to coaches. He shouldn't even break camp with the team, and Lenny Sosa should stand at first. See what I'm saying here? Like, it really should be, are these guys responding to what we're looking for them to do? Hyatt Home Medical Equipment wants to help you switch to a new age of life, keep mom and dad, grandma and grandpa out of assisted living, and make it so they can get around on their own, living independently. Hyatt has stair lifts, ramps, grab bars, lift chairs, and even bathroom remodeling. And they work with your insurance and have 0% financing for qualified individuals. If you use a CPAP machine and you're unhappy with your vendor, switch and get supplies directly mailed to you. They also have the latest in continuous glucose monitors and so much more. Hyatt Home Medical Equipment. Learn all about them at hhme.com. Joining me on the phone line right now, our good friend, James Fox from FutureSox, who jumps on and talks prospects with us and always has a lot of good things to say, and a lot of things he talks about come to fruition. So that's why he joins us here on Sox in the Basement. How are you, friend?
I am good, sir. What's going on?
It's not the exciting offseason I wanted, but there's things happening.
Yeah, it's a lot of moves.
Yeah, it's a lot of moves. I don't know what the moves mean, but it's a lot of moves, and now we got the international free agency thing coming up here, and you got this big pitcher that everybody's going after, and some teams are holding their money back because they're trying to sign him. So teams that are going after Sasaki, they're not probably going to go get a different international prospect because they're trying to hold all their bonus pool money. Am I getting that correct? So now the White Sox might be able to slide in and make some moves.
Yeah, and one of the potential issues with that is, like, these international classes come into focus, like, 2 years prior. So, like, a lot of these kids, and we've talked about this on this show before, like, they agree to deals at, like, the age of 13 or 14 a lot of times, and then they'll just kind of shut it down and stay with their trainer and whatever, right? So that's one big reason why sometimes these deals look bad, right? Like, some guys sign for $500,000 and then really develop, and it looks like a steal. Other guys sign for $2 million and then get fat or whatever and stink. And, it's a really weird marketplace. But the issue with that is, like, when a talent like Rōki Sasaki becomes available, you're going to need pretty much your whole bonus pool to sign him, it sounds like. So the Dodgers, Padres, Jays, right? They're going to need upwards of like $5.5 million in their pool. All of those teams have prior commitments. So, like, you basically have to renege on those deals essentially, or trade for more money, or both. And it's already started to happen with the Dodgers specifically. They lost their top guy, went to the Pirates, I'm sure you saw. And then the White Sox got in on the action last night. They signed Orlando Patino, who's a Venezuelan outfielder. They're giving him $570K. He was supposed to get $400,000 from the Dodgers. Just who knows, right? He's a 16-year-old with a muscular build, huge raw power. I like signing guys that the Dodgers signed, so that part's good. And there's also rumors that some of the Padres guys might be back out in the marketplace today. Some of them have scrubbed their Instagrams, and people are Twitter sleuthing, because if Sasaki goes to the Padres, like, they're probably going to have to cancel their deals to sign him. So yes, this is one of the benefits to the White Sox having money left over. Their pool was like $6.2 million originally. They did make a change. David Keller from the Mets is now running their international operation. But as I said, these deals have been done. So this is basically a Marco Patti class with some money left over, and now David Keller out in the marketplace trying to do some work there, essentially. And I can get into some of the other names if you want, but that's essentially the gist of, like, what's happening right now.
But with David Keller in there now, if he goes and grabs one of these Padres guys, or the guy that they just snagged that would have gone to the Dodgers, those are his moves. That's based upon his research when he was with the Mets. Is that the best way to kind of understand that? Because he hasn't been in there long enough to research guys that are coming back on the market.
No, and he did a bunch of this work with the Mets. He wasn't their director, but he was like a high-ranking, like one of the top scouts in the organization that was working on international scouting. So I'm pretty sure him and like the scouts under him know who these guys are. I wouldn't be surprised if they made another move or two, because so the White Sox started with $6.2 million. They're, I think they have like 1.6 left based on like what's reporting, and they have like 10 players. I wrote up an international preview over at FutureSox. Their top signing is, I think he just turned 18, Alejandro Cruz. He's a Cuban third baseman, shocker, but he's different than a lot of the guys they typically sign because he's a teenager and he's also an athlete that plays third. A lot of times, Marco Patti would sign these guys that had all this power projection and they were just like definite first basemen. This guy's a defender. He's like an athlete with a hit tool. So that's a $2 million signing. Another one of their top signings was also a David Keller signing because they signed this player in December for this class, another Cuban 16-year-old right-handed pitcher, Yobel Rodriguez. It's $300,000. He's a 6'3" righty with projection. He's low 90s plus change. People think he's going to throw in the high 90s eventually. So, there's some signings out of the Dominican Republic. There's some out of Venezuela. It's a lot of pitchers. And the thing that's interesting about pitchers is, like on the international market, pitchers are really cheap. Like they don't get the big deals because they're signing, like I said, when they're 13, and then all of a sudden they're 6'5" and throwing high 90s. So like a lot of the pitching deals are like $300,000-$400,000, and then they just kind of matriculate up. So, I think it's a fine signing class, but I think it's important to know that the White Sox are like under a big restructure here, and they have money in the hopper that they can go out and sign some of these kids who just lost deals. They could also trade the money, in theory, to the Padres or the Dodgers or the Jays for actual prospects or something else potentially.
So there's stuff that they can do and may happen here very shortly. So that's an interesting thing going on here in the offseason. You talk about the international division of the White Sox and the fact that there's a restructuring. There's a new guy in charge. Some of these guys are coming from the old guy that was in there. When you look at what they're probably going to do the rest of this signing period and in the future, what switch do you think that we're going to notice the most? Like, I think back to times we've talked before and the idea that the Sox would grab a guy that was, a little bit more of a name, let's say, internationally, instead of grabbing a bunch of really young guys that could just be used as chips in trades later on. And they weren't as diversified, let's say, in their international signings. Do you think that's going to change now going forward?
Yeah, my guess would be a lot fewer like older Cubans. Like that was like a big time Kenny Williams thing where he just, get this guy, get him into the minors, get him up to the big leagues, that sort of thing. And it's just not the way most teams operate. I do think they're going to be active in the market going forward. David Keller told James Fegan of Sox Machine, like, this is like an avenue to acquire premium talent for really cheap. And that's what they need to do, right? A bunch of shortstops, a bunch of center fielders, like from the Dominican Republic, like sign a bunch of them every year because like those guys are expensive, right? You want premium upside talent in Major League Free Agency. It's really expensive. It's expensive in the draft too. This is the place where, even the top guys, Chris, like are $5 million. I mean, that's like nothing for these teams, right? And the White Sox are rarely active at the top of this market like the other teams, like the Padres and, even like the Dodgers and some of these other clubs. So I think that's a big change. Also, they're building a new facility in the Dominican Republic. That's a big change. So I think a couple of things just to focus on over the next couple of years, just their classes skewing much younger, more Dominican players, and far less of the like Yoelqui Cespedes, Oscar Colas type, like 20-plus-year-old Cuban guys.
All right, so let's take a look at the team right now as it stands. Like you said, there's been a lot of moves that have happened this offseason. A lot of people would consider them to be small moves, but they're clearly remaking what type of player they bring in, and the infield is going to be a logjam. Like, I look at all the guys that have been acquired who's still around, looking at the guys that we got to see play last year, my impressions of them, and I try to guess who's making this roster. Like, of the guys that play infield on the Chicago White Sox, I feel as though I'm going to see Andrew Vaughn, Lenin Sosa, maybe Chase Mydroth, a Josh Rojas, and possibly a Colson Montgomery, like walking out the gate because it seems like Chris Getz wants to get him in there. But I'm wrong. There's no way I've got it right. You probably have names. There's no way you're going to get them 100%. But what did I miss there? Who am I missing? Who am I putting in that shouldn't be there? Who did I leave out?
No, I think you're kind of on it. I think the one interesting thing about Chase Maedroff is everybody just like has kind of penciled him in, and I don't necessarily disagree, but he's the one guy that's not on the 40-man roster, so you would have to make a move for him. I think you're right about, so Andrew Vaughn's the first baseman. I think Josh Rojas is probably the second baseman, or like, playing somewhere every day. And then look, like they have Miguel Vargas, who, like he's probably playing third. Like there's just, I think they're going to give him playing time regardless of like what the fans kind of thought of him to close out the year. Brian Ramos is in the mix. Lenyn Sosa is interesting for me because I've obviously like always been a big fan. He hit a ton like down the stretch and in the winter league, but I just don't know that they're married to Lenyn Sosa. I know that they've moved on from quite a few of the Marco Patti signings and some of these guys from the old regime. So I definitely wouldn't consider him like safe by any means. Brooks Baldwin is interesting as a prospect, but he's probably a utility type.
He also feels like there's not enough room for him. Like you listed all these names, and I go, I don't know how a guy that had about 10 games, whatever it was, in AAA, and didn't do anything last year somehow fights his way onto this roster with all these other names that we're mentioning.
Well, the thing that I find interesting is the shortstop position. When Rojas was signed, I was hoping that he had played more shortstop, right? I was like, oh, that's the veteran shortstop ad. Great. But then you kind of look at it, and he's been mostly at second and third, so I don't know that they'll do that. Maedroff did play a lot of short, even though he's like a second base projection. The thing that I'm not a huge fan of, and it might happen, right? Like Colson Montgomery might be the shortstop to start the year. I'm not a huge fan of that idea. You've had me on enough. I don't love spring training. I hate spring training battles and like the thought of like winning a job because it's like mostly meaningless. I want Colson Montgomery to go to Charlotte and perform and then come up. Like, I want you to insulate yourself enough to make all these guys force their way to the big leagues. And I just I don't know that like Colson Montgomery hitting 340 in spring training means that he should be the opening day shortstop right away. Like I kind of want to see more. Like, look, I think he plays 100 plus games in the big leagues for sure. I'm not a huge fan of like penciling him at shortstop, but your Scott Merkins of the world and other people are writing about it. So I think it's definitely an option. I don't love that idea.
Before I let you go, I'm curious. We see all these moves. They all are like small little moves, but they seem to be moves that bring in at least professional baseball players and kind of send the message to guys that haven't proved it yet in the majors. You have to at least beat this guy out for a job. And it seems like that's something that's happening. Like if you're not good enough, you won't stick here, or you won't earn a spot on this team. Do you see any other additions coming? Like if it were you, what else would you like them to add to this team?
I mean, I think we get more like non-roster invite type guys. I mean, to me, like if they added a veteran shortstop, I wouldn't be surprised. Where you're like, oh yeah, that's this year's Paul DeYoung, right? Because like if Colson Montgomery is awesome, that type of guy's not going to stand in the way anyway, right? Like it doesn't matter. Like look at the catching duo, right? You have two professional catchers that are just okay, right? If Kyle Teel or Edgar Caro is unbelievable at AAA, like they're just going to bring those guys up and get rid of one of these veteran catchers. Like it doesn't matter. The other thing, I would like a left-handed first base DH type, whether it's, whoever, right? Your fantasy baseball, Dan Vogelbach or Rowdy Tellez or just, one of these guys that can hit from the left side. That's just like a counterpoint to Andrew Vaughn. They did sign a guy, last week, Bobby Dahlbeck was a former Red Sox prospect with huge power, but also a ton of strikeouts, but he's another right-handed hitter. So he's very similar to what they already have in like a Tim Elko at Charlotte. So, the one thing I'll say is I love this roster churn, right? It's just a bunch of different names and like you're doing a lot of different things. And me and Ian on our podcast, like at the beginning of this offseason, there were like 10 to 12 names on the 40-man where you're like, yeah, these guys are no big deal. Just get rid of them. Now, whenever a move is made, I'm legit curious to see the 40-man move because it's getting a little bit tougher. There's quite a few guys on this 40-man that you would like to potentially keep. And if they keep making more moves, like it's going to be interesting, like who gets DFA'd and who they kind of give up on early.
Chris Getz is starting to get a little ruthless, and I kind of like it. Like, you know what? You're not the guy. I mean, he got rid of a couple guys in the last couple of weeks that he acquired through trade. And he's only had a few trades. He's a young GM if you think about how long he's been in there, and he is not married to anyone, it doesn't feel like.
Yeah, and I don't think they can be because he's like they're going to be bad, and they obviously don't have money to spend, right? Like the offseason that you and I wanted, we didn't get just because it seems like the owner's not letting them spend. But it does seem like they're doing a decent job of using the limited resources that they do have for like a veteran right field platoon, a Martin Perez, like Josh Rojas has some upside. Like I think they're getting okay players for like the very little amount of money that they're actually spending. So that part's a little bit positive, I think.
We try to find the positive in just not a very good time for winning with the White Sox. James Fox from FutureSox, always nice to jump on here. Thanks so much, my friend.
All righty. Thanks, man.
Sox in the Basement listeners trying to make the most of your money, give a call to Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor. Located on the corner of 111th and Kedzie, but serving the Chicagoland area, Tom has a get-to-know-you approach and a do-the-right-thing attitude. He's been doing this for decades. It's all about knowing your options when you're investing and planning for your retirement. No matter what stage you are at, it costs nothing to check in with Tom. Give Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor, a call today, 773-779-0023. Edward Jones, member SIPC. Who do you think is making it and not making it? Because I can't even imagine Ramos making it on this team or Brooks Baldwin at this point.
No, I think Brian Ramos, Brooks Baldwin, Lenine Sosa to a certain degree. I think those guys have a huge hill to climb. I think you have a situation where Chase Mydroth can surprise, but I think he is probably on the outside looking in.
Because he's not on the 40-man and they would have to get rid of somebody else probably.
Right. You know, he's not been set up so far to be a guy that's coming north.
Yeah, but Getz talked about him like he loved him. That was the thing. Like Getz in that recent interview was like, we got a steal here. Like, Boston knew he was really good. We know he's really good. It might not show up when you read all these prospect things, but this is a real Major League Baseball player. Like he kind of gushed about him a little bit.
And that's why I think he's got a real chance. But when you're talking about walking into spring training, like who's got a hill to climb and who's already kind of got the benefit of the doubt, I think that Mydroth still falls into that category. But I also think that of the guys that are on the hill, it's a precarious position. Okay, there's a cliff on the other side of it. Miguel Vargas, Andrew Vaughn, Brooks Baldwin, these guys are staring over a precipice. I think the only guy that has a real leash going in one way or the other is Colson Montgomery. I think Montgomery and Josh Rojas are probably the two guys that you can sit there and say, if Montgomery comes north with the team, they are giving him every opportunity to fight his way through it, whatever it is, if he doesn't succeed at first.
Watch him sign a veteran shortstop because Rojas doesn't play a lot of shortstop. Like, watch him go out and do one more.
Right, and that's an entirely possible thing.
Right, and then you're like, well, Rojas is making the team, and this guy that they just signed is making the team, and they're going to bring Vaughn because they gave him $6 million. Look how this thing might even get tighter. It might. I mean, it's really one of the more interesting things.
You might be looking at one position for all those prospects.
Yeah, I mean, because it really is. It might be very, very tight at the beginning, and it might be one of those things where, like, you better be ready to take a job and hold it forever if you're going to make it to the major leagues. Much like when you look at the amount of guys that are going to show up to pitch. I mean, I mentioned some of them. Don't forget about Nick Nastrini, Jake Eder, Winkleman Gonzalez, Kai Busch. Yeah. All these guys are on the 40-man. I mentioned Mason Adams along with all those other guys that I was mentioning. There's a lot of pitchers that are going to show up that have a legit chance that if they impress, could be the fifth starter.
If those pitchers in particular, if they show up, throwing strikes, limiting walks, keeping guys off base, especially in a hitter-friendly environment, there's going to be surprises. I guarantee you that whatever you think is going to happen for the 26-man roster right now before spring training even starts, we have no idea what surprises await, and there's going to be some stuff that makes us sit there and go, I never saw that coming.
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on soxinthebasement.com.